Come on, Boon, get your ass in gear. We gotta get moving.
But I didn't know they had a card shop here. Woo! Is that a Judge promo Meddling Mage?
Let's go!
But they have Aether Vials! I need those for stuff!
You can spend all your money on cardboard later. We gotta get to the Orb of Chaos before...
I'm sorry, the what now?
The Orb of Chaos. You know, ancient artifact capable of warping reality around it. We need it to beat Superfire.
Wait, who?
He's the one that's on fire.
Oh, right. You know no one actually cares about the info dump you're trying to give. Don't...
Get down!
You there. You're the Boon Diddly Do, right? Sure? Good. That's good. I would like to request you to perform the communist potato. I'm sorry, the what? The communist potato. Is that a Bjork song?
He's asking you to do a commentary.
Oh. Wait, how the fuck did you figure that out?
Apparently one of the 500 languages in my database is strong bad.
That makes perfect sense, and I will question it in no way whatsoever. Alright, dude. I'm guessing you've got some kind of Pokemon-related material for me? No. Why would I ask you for the Pocketmans? Well, I mean, you are a Pokemon, so I would have guessed that... Wow, that is super racist. Here is Badoo! TheManaSource? Why the fuck would I commentate on TheManaSource? Wedge makes good videos, generally has a positive vibe, and I watch his stuff on a regular basis. In fact, I've watched this video. It's a good video. Don't care. Well, I suppose there's plenty I could add to the discussion in regards to this particular topic, since I don't get to talk about these sorts of things very much. And there are a couple of cases where I think Wedge might be jumping to conclusions about Wizard's intentions. Alright then. Let's do this.
We have breaking news, some ridiculous information that we have to talk about. In an unprecedented move, Wizards of the Coast announced their new banned and restricted update a week early. Emrakul the Promised End, Smuggler's Copter, and Reflector Mage are all now banned in Standard, gone forever from Standard until the end of time. Gitaxian Probe and Golgari Grave Troll are both banned from Modern. I can't imagine the collective gasps, sighs, screams, freakouts, and questions you all must have.
So let me add some context to what he's saying for the large portion of my audience that doesn't play Magic, and for those who may be rushing to the comments to tell me off or something even though it's probably already too late to tell them that. I'm writing this video 3 days after this announcement, and Wedge's video came out the day of the announcement, so it's probable that there's new information that both of us may have missed, which I'll likely have the advantage of being able to add in through text if I need be. Both of our videos were also written before the bannings are in effect, except mine was written right after they took effect on Magic Online, but I'll do my best to not bother using that data if possible. That being said, let me tell you guys when the last time cards were banned in the Standard format was. Summer of 2011. Yeah, no joke. The fact that they banned something in Standard is a huge deal, since Standard is the primary format that Wizards test for when making a new set. Therefore, normally banning a card in Standard is an admission that they made a mistake. However, as Wedge is going to point out, this may no longer be the case.
We'll begin with both Emrakul the Promised End and Smuggler's Copter. Wizards of the Coast banned these cards, citing decreased diversity in the Standard format. They said that Emrakul was banned because she faced too little resistance and ended games far too easily. They banned Smuggler's Copter because it was too efficient and used in too many strategies, again, decreasing diversity in the format. This was their attempt to reduce homogenization. If we're being real for a second, logically speaking, these bans do make a little sense. Smuggler's Copter is in more than 60% of all decks, which is an absurd number when you think about it. It truly is a staple of the format. So if they're going to cite diversity in decks, then there is justification there.
However, if I may, I'd like to point to something that Wizards indicated as a reason that Smuggler's Copter was banned that Wedge didn't bring up. Efficiency. The fact of the matter is that Smuggler's Copter is a 3/3 flying creature for 2 mana. Sure, you need to tap another creature in order to use it, but just about anything other than a 0 power creature can power the thing as either an attacker or a blocker. And because Crew is an effect on Smuggler's Copter rather than the creature, that creature can tap even if it has summoning sickness. So if your opponent hasn't got a good strategy going, or you can outrace them with the Copter, you can just play a creature on turn 3, tap it to crew the Copter, and hit your opponent for 3. And even if they have something to block it with, you get the opportunity to cycle through your deck if you want. So if you have a card that's not going to help you in your hand, you can trade it in for something that might do you a little bit better. Or you can get a card that's not going to help you out of your deck if it's less useful. And yes, I'm aware that the fact that the Copter is this efficient is probably why it's used in so many strategies, but also consider the fact that the Copter also stifles what kind of strategies can be used because of how it works. Think about it. Everyone's getting 3 damage on turn 3. Everyone's drawing extra cards every turn, so what happens? Decks that run at a slower pace simply cannot keep up. You need to run flying creatures to block the Copter, or else you'll wind up having to trade your removal spells with it, which isn't good when that's not even the main threat of the 60% of the decks it goes in. Now don't get me wrong, I think Smuggler's Copter was a good idea, but unfortunately I think that due to both changes in Standard made by Wizards and simply some development oversight, it deserves the ban. There's a little bit more I could say about Smuggler's Copter specifically, but Wedge is going to talk about that momentarily.
As for Emrakul, Aetherworks Marvel isn't the most played deck in the format. If we're talking popularity, both Mardu Vehicles and Blue-White Flash are played more than that deck. And even then, getting Emrakul out isn't a guarantee, kind of the point of the entire thing. Of course, even if you take that into account, Marvel decks are almost 20% of the meta, which is still a high number. It just doesn't seem as high because there are really only 2 other decks at the top.
Unfortunately, in this particular instance, I think Wedge is missing part of the big picture. See, whether or not the deck was at the very top of the format, Red-Black Aggro still took up 10% of the meta on the 11th, mind you. You also have to consider if the strategy it goes in locks out anything. Namely, it makes strategies that don't win or put themselves in a situation where it's very difficult to lose by turn 4, the first turn that you could play Aetherworks Marvel to cheat out Emrakul at a much lower consistency, as they can easily get locked out of the game. As for your statement about Emrakul not being a guarantee off of an activation of Aetherworks Marvel, allow me to do the calculations to see how likely it really is. I'm going to assume the scenario where you have the most cards left in your deck, and that 3 Emrakuls are left in your deck, since you have about a 50% chance of drawing 1, but only a 12% chance of drawing 2, so this will represent a realistic worst case scenario. That comes out to approximately a 32% chance. In other words, under the realistic worst case scenario for Emrakul, there's about a 1 in 3 chance you get it anyway. And it's not like your game is over if you have to cast something else instead off of the Marvel, especially since your probability for getting Emrakul will likely go up if you do it again. Now, of course, the argument still exists that you've only got a 1 in 3 shot under these conditions, and you'd have a point, but the amount of resistance one can offer against Emrakul is also cited as a reason that Emrakul is busted. True, we do have sorcery speed removal, especially Declaration in Stone, but one thing to remember is Emrakul's cast effect. Take control of an opponent's next turn. It doesn't really matter if you get an extra turn if your opponent can stop that turn from mattering by getting rid of anything you could use against Emrakul. That, at the end of the day, is why Emrakul doesn't get enough resistance, because the combination of its abilities make it nearly impossible to deal with. Now, of course, there are other cards an Aetherworks Marvel deck can use to win the game, but I'll touch on those more in a minute, as a later statement Wedge makes points towards what I'd be talking about.
This format truly is lacking diversity at the peak, but this brings me to a point we need to discuss. We've had formats like this in the past, formats that were utterly dominated by a few decks, and Wizards never batted an eye. Standard bans are incredibly rare, especially when a card has only been out a few months. And while I understand the justification around banning the Copter and to a certain degree Emrakul as well, we have to realize what this means. Wizards is clearly taking a more intense look at Standard. They want players to attend tournaments, and they want more players to have more fun. If they need to destroy the 2 best cards in the format, they will.
Okay, feel free to chalk this up to just me having a different opinion, but the 2 best cards in the format? I mean, as much as I talked about Emrakul being really powerful, it still costs 9 mana at the cheapest, and the reason it's so competitive in such a fast-moving format is because of that 1 in 3 chance of getting it out with its cast effect on turn 4, where it shouldn't be able to come out. I would argue the Copter being the best card in the format, yes, but as for the best card in the format from the point of view of the Marvel deck, I'd have to say that it's Marvel, baby!
That was the worst thing ever.
Buzzkill.
Asswipe.
Fun burger.
I am not good at the insulting.
Clearly.
But that's not the real problem. The real problem is what we're going to talk about now. Reflector Mage was banned because, quote, our data showed the white-blue flash deck was too powerful against the field, and Reflector Mage has been on players' lists of most disliked cards since the days of Collected Company. They also use the word frustrating to describe the mage.
Well, they also, earlier in the same article, elaborate on the fact that White-Blue Flash is a deck that unbalanced the format, thus why they are targeting that deck specifically. This is also the only ban that's specific to White-Blue Flash as well. The fact that you call this a problem is concerning enough, but you're going to expand on this. This is probably the only part of the video that I have any real issue with, honestly.
Control cards have always been viewed as frustrating or unfun. The current reaction to Reflector Mage is actually nothing new. And while yes, Blue-White Flash is crazy powerful, banning Reflector Mage because it's, quote, unfun is a bit overkill. It sets a very dangerous precedent, and honestly, if this is how they view cards like this, I think we can kiss pure control goodbye forever.
And there's my issue. Okay, Wedge, real talk. Let me just explain why Reflector Mage is too powerful a control card for Standard, and why the other control cards you put up on the screen aren't even apt comparisons. So first, let's dissect what Reflector Mage actually does. First of all, he's a 2/3 for 3 mana. That's not impressive, and he'd need a decent effect to be worth playing. He can return any creature an opponent controls to the hand when he hits the field, which already makes him worth playing considering the stats. It slows down your opponent, which is exactly what control wants to do, and it lets you get in if you have the ability to do so. But it's the last part of the ability that really busts him. They can't recast what you bounced on their next turn. Whew, boy. Now, normally, returning a creature to the hand will serve to keep them out of combat for essentially a full turn. One less block they can do if they're untapped, and one less attack they can do because of Summoning Sickness. However, what this does is give you an entire extra turn of that instead. The block that they don't get, the attack and block that they miss from not being able to cast the creature, and the attack they miss due to Summoning Sickness. And it's not like you can get around this if you have a removal spell for Reflector Mage. If the mage goes, the effect stays because it's part of the triggered ability. We compare this to a frustrating card like Spell Queller, who despite having the same stats plus flying, actually gives you the spell back for free if you get rid of him, and can't go after anything you have to invest a lot of mana into. In other words, even though Spell Queller is more effective in combat, he's the more balanced card. So to say they're getting rid of pure control when you can counter a spell with a creature, or without one for that matter, for the same amount of mana is asinine, since that's much more pure method of control than bounce with an extra upside. And now I'd like to address why Reflector Mage is nowhere near the same as the other 2 guards you put on screen. First of all, even though Sphinx's Revolution can be cast for 3 mana, you're never going to do that since it does nothing if you do, and Ojutai costs 5. So there goes the stage of the game where you can play them being the same. More importantly, look at the main thing that those other cards do. Draw cards. I'm sorry, but if your primary example of frustrating control is something that can get more of the card they've banned into your hand, then that's a bad example of the banning creating a dangerous precedent. Sphinx's Revelation does gain you life, yes, which can help keep you alive much longer, but I would argue that that's much more fun to play against than Reflector Mage, since you're not undoing your opponent's board position, you're just moving the goalpost for them to win. As for Ojutai, the only stopping power he actually has is in the form of being able to stop the opponent from getting rid of him, and any control deck will tell you that that just makes him a good finisher. He supports the ability for the rest of the deck to control the field while having protection to keep himself alive long enough to get the kill. However, I would like to play devil's advocate for Reflector Mage as well. If White-Blue Flash weren't such an oppressive deck, I would say that this ban wouldn't be needed, but the fact that it is means that the most oppressive card in it should get the axe. However, I also feel that Reflector Mage is exactly what a modern player looking to build control may want. One turn of Breathing Room is simply not as significant an amount of time in Modern as it is in Standard, so a card like this, despite being susceptible to Lightning Bolt, may allow for control strategies outside of Grixis to exist, and perhaps open the format by, to use some fighting game terminology for a moment, keep strategies like Infect and Affinity honest, force them to play around it, thus taking away some of that oppressive aggression that they provide. My point about Reflector Mage in Standard still stands, but that's not to say that Wedge is entirely wrong. It does show that a pushed control card could get banned out in the future, especially considering they're actually addressing stagnant Standard formats now. But I think to say that it outright sets a dangerous precedent is jumping the gun.
Because control is frustrating to play against. It always has been. And while I do not necessarily agree with the mage ban personally, they have every right to do this if their goal is to destroy archetypes. But for the record, Reflector Mage, that might have been too far. Overkill after the Copter.
I feel I've thoroughly covered his point about Reflector Mage, and even though I agree with him that they are trying to create more diversity, I want to point out that terminology he used, breaking archetypes. That may not be appropriate here, since that implies that the archetypes that were hit have no options for recovery. And to that, I'd like to bring up why White-Blue Flash and Aetherworks Marvel are far from dead archetypes. First, let's talk about the Flash deck. On top of the fact that they banned a card that doesn't have the namesake mechanic of the deck, there's also the fact that we've got plenty of other ways to return creatures to the hand in Standard. For an example that you'd play at the same time you'd play Reflector Mage, there's Drag Under, which, although unable to stop your opponent from replaying the card on their next turn, does let you draw a card, which can help you fish for more solid answer down the line, which is the whole point of bounce spells, by the way. Fairgrounds Warden can also serve a similar purpose, only now they have to actually use a card to get rid of the Warden instead of just replaying it in 2 turns. Imprisoned in the Moon isn't completely permanent since the opponent can just get rid of the enchantment if they're able to, but it's certainly a viable answer to any threat you'd want to use Reflector Mage on. Royal Spout puts the creature on top of the library to interfere with the opponent's draw, and those are just 3 mana cards that are either white, blue, or both, never mind the cards at other costs. Some White-Blue Flash decks also use Thalia Heretic Cathar, who can combine with a Return to Hand effect to make an effect that buys 2 turns, much like Reflector Mage, and it'll buy the extra turn even if the opponent has some other creature. In addition, there's a new 4-cost 3/2 flying creature, not quite as good as Reflector Mage since it doesn't force the opponent to recast the creature, and it's more susceptible to red removal, but depending on what kinds of opposition you're expecting, it'll do in a pinch. And now we finally return to the Marvel deck, which already has an alternative to Emrakul in the sideboard, Ulamog. It gets the cast effect to exile 2 permanents, is susceptible to mostly the same removal as Emrakul, maybe with a few differences, and he eats the opponent's library when he attacks, so the only real difference is that Ulamog can't really make the removal that's useful against him null and void. Kozilek will fill up your hand if you've used a bunch of cards getting your energy counters, and since most removal is low costed, Kozilek can protect himself. You can also use Desolation Twin to get double the creatures that will typically need double the removal, or you can use other big creatures, but I'd say Ulamog is the best outright replacement for Emrakul in the Marvel deck because it does the most for the strategy. I don't even really need to argue about Smuggler's Copter, as it's used in nearly everything, so that's hardly what I'd call breaking any given archetype regardless. So no, Wedge, I don't think these archetypes have been broken in the sense that you used the word. I just think that other archetypes, including ones that we don't even know about yet, are going to stand a better chance.
We turn our attention to Modern, and honestly, this could be even more insane than Standard. We'll begin with Gitaxian Probe because this is going to be a short conversation. Played in almost 20% of all decks, Phyrexian Mana makes this the most flexible draw spell in the entire format. And Wizards makes a decent point when they say that it does give combo decks and turn 3 kill decks an unfair advantage. I've seen it a million times, but let's get something straight. Gitaxian Probe isn't being banned because of the card text. It's being banned because it costs 1 Phyrexian mana.
Just to sound like a jackass for a minute, you know that the card text includes the reminder text for how Phyrexian Mana works, right? That kind of leads into my point though. If it was simply because of Phyrexian Mana, then cards like Surgical Extraction and Mental Misstep would also be banned in Modern. On the other hand, if the Phyrexian Mana were replaced by only a single blue mana, it wouldn't get banned either. In other words, the real reason it was banned is both of those things. But on a side note, why the fuck are only 20% of decks using this thing? Is it because only 20% of decks are blue? Considering what we're talking about here, why the fuck does that matter?
But the real big news, that's the last topic we have to cover. Golgari Grave Troll has been banned, but the card itself being banned isn't even the most impactful thing that happened. The reasoning behind it jarring. Quote, Dredge, the mechanic and the deck has a negative impact on Modern by pushing the format too far toward a battle of sideboards. So straight up, Wizards of the Coast is literally saying that Dredge is bad for Modern. Wizards denounces the entire mechanic, then bans its best card, and clearly doesn't want it to be a thing. So again, let me be clear. If Dredge can somehow ever exist again successfully, Wizards of the Coast will 100% ban it out again every time. This is a precedent now. Dredge is not meant to be a played mechanic in Modern. Done. Over. And that is scary as all heck. Called, quote, unhealthy for the format, Dredge took the format by storm and is now hit hard again. So what does this say to other alternative deck choices? If they become too powerful, will they get banned out?
Well, not necessarily. I think we need to figure out why Dredge in particular is considered unhealthy, because honestly, the argument as it's presented can easily be levied against Infect as well. It forces you to go with the sideboard if you want to rely on more than luck in order to have a good shot at winning, at least in most cases. However, I think that there are a couple of particular factors. First of all, Dredge is an engine where you play lots of stuff for free. True, most of the things you get to play are very small, but the fact that you can start this engine up on turn 1 if you have something like Insolent Neonate makes it very fast. It's also much more difficult to stop than Infect. There's a lot of different ways to deal with what Infect does, like using Spell Skite to neutralize the power increasing spells, or simply bringing in extra removal that you might bring in against other archetypes. Okay, great. You can get rid of the prized amalgam that's probably going to come right back next turn. Big whoop. Dredge's resources also have the tendency to be renewable because of how they work. Oh, and heaven forbid should someone decide to make a Psychic Spiral mill variant. At that point, the only sideboard option you have is a sideboard option that only works against Dredge, namely Mass Graveyard Hate. And Modern's actually faster than Legacy, so you might not have time to get it if you're not running 4, and even if you are, Dredge's primary weakness is in Game 2, so they can just bring in their anti-sideboard sideboard. In other words, Dredge creates a war of sideboards for the same reason that it does in Legacy. There's really only one thing you can do against it. Even Infect can be beaten by stuff that beats other decks, but Dredge? Other than Pyromaster's Ascension, who else are you hurting with your sideboard anti-graveyard cards?
The absolute last part of the announcement was Wizards letting us all know that they're actually changing how they do all of this. Quote, banned and restricted announcements will now be made both on the Monday after standard legal set pre-releases and 5 weeks after a Pro Tour, also on a Monday. This means that they're going to be able to react to formats twice as fast, which in your mind should translate to mean that they will have a tighter hold on these constructed formats going forward, and we could just end up never seeing a truly dominant deck ever again. This year is going to be interesting, to say the absolute least.
This is the last thing you really cover, so I'll just move on to final thoughts after this. I certainly agree with Wizards on the decision to make ban list changes twice a set instead of once a set, although I would like to note that it seems likely that there will be times when they choose not to change anything because the formats are particularly balanced. After last year's debacle with the Eldrazi meta in Modern and lower attendance rates at tournaments during Eldritch Moon and Kaladesh, I think Wizards decided they needed, at the very least, to examine each format more often, which I feel was a very good move. 5 weeks after the Pro Tour is a perfect time to add a ban list announcement too, as it comes right after a standard format is starting to get into a spot of complacency. It also gives Wizards a bit more freedom with what they print in standard legal sets. They can print some stuff that really needs more printings, and then take it out of standard if it warps the format too much. It allows more risks, which is a good thing. And as much as Mark Rosewater says that restriction breeds creativity, too much restriction can also stifle it, as with White Blue Flash. So Wedge, in your video you said you wanted to know what people thought in the comments, but I had a lot of thoughts on the matter, so I hope you don't mind that I just went ahead and made a video concerning my thoughts instead. I think that maybe there's a couple of factors you may not be looking into, and a couple of others that maybe you're looking into a bit too deeply. I'm aware that my perspective is different than yours though, so I'm not going to say you're outright wrong, but I did feel a comment simply wasn't enough to say what I needed to say. I finish these videos with advice, don't I? Okay, I got something. Keep doing what you're doing, man. Thumbs up.
Lame.
You done?
No. Lame.